Hello, welcome to Truth and Wellness. I'm so glad that you've joined us today. We know that truth is very important to you. We also know that wellness is something that everyone desires. We're going to be bringing you stories of people who have faced life challenges and have overcome. We also are going to address many relevant issues that you may face in today's world. So I am so glad that you have joined us. I'm McKenzie, and I am your host. Now today, we have a very, very special guest. I happen to know this man here quite well. I've been married to him for 30 years and counting.
36 plus.
36 plus, how's that?
I remembered.
Yes, this is my husband, Mike McKenzie, and so I'm glad that you've come today to join us. My husband, Mike, has a very special story. There are some things that happened to him about 26 years ago, I guess, wasn't it? He had an experience that was life-changing. So today he is going to share with you those events that happened. First of all, I'm going to ask you the question, what was your job, what was your position, what did you do 26 years ago?
I was the youth pastor at Pioneer Memorial Church on the campus of Berrien Springs University.
Okay, you were a youth pastor. So that means you worked with a lot of kids, which I remember very well, yes. Now tell our viewing audience, what were some of the things that you did with kids? What does a youth pastor do?
A lot of things. I worked with the kids at Andrews Academy and Ruth Murdoch Elementary School, but at this particular time I had a student from the seminary who asked me to take some students on a mission trip. Okay. And that's what I think you're particularly interested in.
That's exactly right. And that was Lynn Bryson, by the way.
Yes.
And he was became a good friend of yours, I know. Now what did he tell you about this mission trip? Well, how did you get involved in that?
Lynn had been on a number of trips when he was in college and asked me to join him, and we took four 8th grade students from Ruth Murdoch Elementary School. And so I took those 4 students and we went for 2 weeks to Coletlan in the central state of Mexico. And we went there.
You were quite a ways down in Mexico then, weren't you?
We were.
Yeah, very, very south. Okay. What were some of the things that you were doing? What happens on a mission trip, and what were you doing there specifically?
We were in, like I say, way in the central part of Mexico, and one of the things we did was to build a church. We also went to San Sebastian, which was about 45 minutes by plane ride from where the mission site was, to conduct a medical and dental clinic at that Indian village. We also installed a water system for another Indian village not too far from where the school was. So those were 3 different sites that we did on the mission trip.
So you were all busy.
We were quite busy,
You were doing a lot, yes, right. Okay, now you mentioned something just in passing. You said that one place you had something about planes. Tell us about that.
Well, the Indian village that I mentioned in San Sebastian, it was 45 minutes by plane ride. We had 2 planes that were on the trip. One was a Piper Cherokee, which was a low-wing plane. The other one was a Cessna high-wing plane, and we had to use these to fly different personnel, including some students, but mostly adults that were supervising to fly in supplies, etc. And so that's what we use those for.
Okay. And how long was the mission trip? How long were you gone?
2 weeks long, although I was only going to be there for 1 week because I had to fly back to Berrien Springs for some meetings. And
so there was the key there. You had to leave early.
I did.
You had to get back because you had some events that you were a part of.
Right.
So that put you in a plane. So tell us about the runway, the plane, and what your plans were that day that you were to come back, which was just, by the way, just before your birthday, right? If I remember correctly, I think.
It was. It was on March 26th. My birthday was the 27th, and so on that morning I got up to pack all my stuff, and I did. And 5 of us were going to fly on the Piper Cherokee, which was the 6-cylinder, 6-passenger low-wing plane. We went to the airport. And when I say airport, we're talking about an airport that's basically a dirt strip with a little brick building and a little 85-year-old man who would basically step out the door of the thing and go, "He's okay."
All right.
That's pretty much it. And so we went there. When we got there, the pilot of the plane decided to drain the fuel from the tip tanks of the plane and pour all the fuel into the main tanks of the plane, because he was used to the gauges on the tanks of the main tanks. It was not his personal plane, and so we thought nothing of that. We thought, that's great, no big deal. And so in fact, we actually helped him. So we drained the fuel from the tip tanks, poured all the fuel into the main tanks, and loaded everything, which was basically my luggage and my sleeping bag, and everybody else was going to be staying. And so we got ourselves into the plane and watched the pilot do his pre-flight checks and checking gauges and whatever. And I can remember Lynn Bryson, who was my youth ministry assistant.
Okay, I was going to say, he said something to you, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, I remember you saying that.
I can remember him. I got in the seat just behind the pilot, or actually the co-pilot's seat, and Lynn Bryson is sitting behind me. And I remember saying to Lynn, I remember saying, you know what, I would sure like to learn to fly one of these things. And we're watching the pilot as he's checking things, and we start to taxi down the runway, and we lift off. And I remember looking at my watch. It was 11:13, beautiful day, sunny, a few puffy clouds in the sky. It's about 80 degrees and gorgeous day. We take off, and the Piper Cherokee has a fairly high rate of speed to take off.
So you got up pretty fast, pretty high,
we did.
Right?
80 miles an hour. You take off, and we're accelerating quickly to take off, and we get up about, I don't know, probably a couple hundred feet, and all of a sudden I hear starts to sputter and cough a little bit. And I had just said to Lynn, you know, I'd love to learn to fly one of these things, and that thing starts coughing and sputtering, and I turned to Lynn and I said, well, maybe not right away. I don't want to learn to fly. It's just kind of a joke.
Right.
And I have to,
because you didn't think there was anything
really
major wrong, or anything was going to.
And the reason why I didn't think that is because we had flown in that plane all week long.
Okay.
And in fact, at a couple of the runways that we had landed on, one of them was another dirt runway that was even rougher than the one we had just taken off on when we had landed in San Sebastian. Remember I mentioned the mission village?
Yes.
When we landed on that, the pilot had turned to us and said, now folks, don't panic, but he said, we're going to buzz the runway to make sure there are no cows on the runway.
Okay, we're getting the picture now.
Right, and
it was
so
like
I
here.
thought, well, okay, so, and he did. He buzzed the runway, and when we landed, after making sure there were no cows, this plane shook like you cannot imagine. We hit the runway, the wings are flopping, and you're hanging on your seat like this, and whatever. But no big deal. So I'm used to rough landings and whatever.
Right,
and so I'm thinking to myself, you know, as the plane's coughing and sputtering, I'm thinking to myself, it's no big deal. You know, even if we land, it's probably going to just be, you know, a hard landing or something. They're going to. First of all, we're not going down. They're just going to check the engine and they're going to start it back up. No big deal.
Right. But that's not what happened, is it?
Not quite. And I can remember looking out the window to see if we were going up or down. But what I didn't realize was that a Piper Cherokee, being a low-wing plane, is either full power or you're a rock.
Or you go down.
You just fall out of the sky. And so what happened was when we lost power, that plane fell out of the sky like a rock, literally. And when we landed, it hit the ground. And what happened was, that they described this to me later on, was a pancake landing where the tail of the plane hit the ground, and then the struts in the front caught a little rise in the ground, and it threw the nose into that rise in the ground, and it flipped the plane upside down, and it went another 100 feet and just slammed down upside down.
You were down, weren't
and that
you?
was it.
Yeah, you were down. The pictures were pretty horrendous, I have to say. Looked like some that you see on television when they report a small plane that's gone down. So tell us then, your plane went down. What were you thinking? Were you knocked out? Were you awake? What happened next?
I remember I never lost consciousness, because I can remember I mentioned that I'd seen my watch at takeoff was 11:13, and next thing I remember looking at my watch was 11:15. And all I can remember was that when we came to that my head was down beside my knee, fortunately still attached to my body, but not in a very good position.
Yes, fortunately, thank you.
And all I knew was that there was wreckage just piled in on top of me. And
some of the other, was Roberto on top
yeah,
of you?
well, the two pilot seats were all just kind of ripped loose from the wreckage, and they were piled in somehow on top of me. I didn't realize that's what was, but fortunately the pilot had been knocked unconscious. I say fortunately, unfortunately, he had been knocked unconscious, and I didn't realize that at the time. And it was several minutes until they came to, if you will.
Everybody kind of figured out what was really happening and going on. Yeah, what was that? What had happened?
Well, when he finally came to, he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, and then he got himself out of the wreckage of the plane and pulled his seat out of the plane, and unbuckled the co-pilot and pulled him out of the wreckage of the plane. And he was kind of in a daze because he had a big gash on his forehead, which blood was pouring out of, and it was just very helter-skelter. And I didn't know where the two people behind me, or beside me and behind me, were, because they were on the other side of the wreckage. And then all I could hear was them on the other side of the plane, and I heard voices, but I didn't know what they were doing. And I found out later on that what he was doing was checking them to see how they were. And later on I was told that he grabbed the tow bar of the plane, which is basically a T-shaped piece of metal that's used to tow the plane when it's on the tarmac, because he had a fractured left ankle, and he had fractured ribs, and he had a pierced hole in his leg because the seat that he had been sitting in had a piece of shrapnel that basically was piercing his leg when he was sitting in it, that fortunately had missed the femoral artery in his leg, that had it pierced that, he'd have bled to death right then. Fortunately did not happen though.
Right.
And he used that tow bar of the plane and then walked out to the road.
With a broken ankle.
With a broken ankle.
Broken ankle, probably broken ribs.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And
dazed.
And
he had to walk about how far? Was it about a quarter of a mile or half a mile?
It was probably at least 3/4 of a mile from where we crashed, because we had flown far enough out into the desert before crashing that nobody knew. And I mentioned the other plane.
Nobody knew. There was a plane right after you, ready to take off, right? But why didn't they see you go down, or nobody knew you'd gone down, right?
Apparently we had veered slightly left. They were taking off and going the other direction. And the plane crash had happened far enough, and the pilots of our plane had switched off all the electrical systems. So there was no explosion, no fire, no smoke, no nothing. And there was no sound that was loud enough for them to hear.
That you had come down, so nobody knew.
So they didn't know we were down.
All right.
And so when they took off, they went the other direction. They never saw us. Nobody knew we were down.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was.
That they didn't
know. So when he got out to the road, he scribbled down a note that said.
So this is Roberto. I want to make sure we're clear. Okay, Roberto has gotten out to the road. He knows Spanish, and so he can speak the language, and he can. Okay, so he writes a note.
He wrote a note down. It said, "Plane down, hurt bad, send help." And he flagged down a car and put it in the hands of some Mexican folks that were there, and sent them into the town. And the only thing he did not put on the note was where we were. And so they put it in the hands of the folks and then drove off, and they left the folks that were supervising our team, who then didn't know where to look.
They just got the note.
They just got the note.
That's all they had, was the note.
And so when they left, our team assumed that we had crashed at our destination, not at our origination. So they took off an hour and a half in the wrong direction.
And they drove all that way, didn't they?
And so by the time they got there, they started looking. Have you seen a plane crash? Have you seen a plane crash? Well, nobody had. So then they had to drive all the way back. So by the time they found us, it had been 3 hours that we had lain on the ground.
So now, did they find Roberto first? Did he stay out by the road, or did they, how did they?
When they came back, yes, they found him, and then he led them back to the plane crash site. And meanwhile, we'd been laying there on the ground. And I can remember hearing Vern, who was the actual pilot of the plane, all he would say was, "What happened? Where are we? Did anybody die?" Over and
Wow.
over for 3 hours. He kept asking those 3 questions. What happened? Where are we? Did anybody die? And I can remember thinking that, because he had this gash on his head and there was blood pouring out of it, and I thought, I need to talk to this guy, because if I don't, he's gonna go unconscious and he's gonna die. So for 3 hours I answered his questions. We crashed, Vern. Where are we? We're in Colet-Lan. Did anybody die? No. For 3 hours I answered those 3 questions over and over and over. Over and over and over. And when they finally found us, they drove out into the desert with 2 Ford Ranchero car pickup type cars.
So there's no ambulance that came.
No,
There was nothing
no.
that we are used to here
no.
in this country. And
No.
so they were 2 Ford Rancheros. I want everybody to get that picture, because if you know what those are, it's just kind of like a little pickup car. That's what it is, with a pickup in the back, pickup bed.
But the good thing was that the first 2 people who got to us, one was an EMT, and the other one was a respiratory therapist. They were medical people that were on our mission team. They were the very first 2 people that got to the site, and they went around and assessed all of us to see what the nature of our injuries were, so that it was a God thing that the first 2 people who got to our site were medical people. God knew what he was doing in terms of who he sent to us first. And
so he was already working, wasn't he?
He
in the
was,
midst of
he was.
something that was really pretty bad. Yeah.
And I can remember, when I first, when the plane crash first happened, I can remember I was half in and half out of the plane, because the plane was upside down with the wings, kind of a tent-like thing, and I was.
I remember you telling about that.
And I can remember feeling, I couldn't feel my legs, but I knew I was uncomfortable, and I remember twisting and turning and corkscrewing my way, not realizing that I had a spinal injury at the time. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I was twisting and turning, and I ended up corkscrewing my way down to where my head got wedged, kind of almost wedged underneath the wing of the plane, and I reached around and pulled something over to put my head up, and didn't realize that I had pulled a piece of cactus and put my head on a piece of cactus to use for a pillow, and my back hurt so much that the cactus didn't even hurt. And I laid with my head on a piece of cactus for 3 hours, and when they finally found me, I had scratches all over my face, didn't even register, because pain is a relative thing. When something hurts so bad, nothing else can hurt at all. And I guess when you saw me in the hospital later,
yes, I remember very much you. I mean, he was just very
But
scratched,
they took us in those car pickups over to a doctor's office.
Okay.
And then the doctor.
And what happened there?
Well,
because that was
the
their
doctor
first
looked
stop.
at us and saw.
And how far away was that? I mean, they had to go a ways, right?
They
I mean,
drove
you were,
about an hour and a half to a doctor's office.
So here you are. You've been 3 hours or more on the ground. Then they find you and they assess you, so it probably took more time. Then you're an hour and a half in the back of a Ford Ranchero with what we have not said, what injuries that you and 2 others had sustained, and what were those injuries?
Well, when we got to what they called it a hospital. We would call it a doctor's office, because it was very limited facilities, but they did have X-ray facilities. And Lynn Bryson, my youth ministry assistant, they took him down the hall and X-rayed him, and I can remember hearing him scream terribly. It was just horrific as they X-rayed him, and he actually had a stroke as they X-rayed him.
Yes, it was
they almost lost him.
Very scary at the time.
And the little Catholic nuns prayed over him, and he actually revived.
Wow.
It was a miracle that he even
Wow.
survived that.
Wow.
But when they X-rayed him, the doctors went, no mas, no mas, no mas.
They weren't going to do anything more than that.
They knew, because when they saw his X-ray, they realized that he had lumbar 1 and T12, the lumbar vertebra in the lower back, were simply exploded. They were just disintegrated from the compression reaction
from
fractures.
hitting with the tail, because you were sitting in the back, and that's what you.
And so they knew that his injuries, and they knew that mine and Janet, who was sitting next to me, that all 3 of us had compression reaction fractures.
Right. Okay.
And so they said that there's nothing more we can do. And at that point, a gentleman who was an American gave our team director.
Now, I kind of want to interrupt you there just a minute, because this was really miraculous, wasn't it? That there was somebody in the town that had heard from the people that were talking about this accident with Americans that had come, the plane had come down, And this man came in to your group leader and brought him something. What was that?
Yes, he had clipped out about 6 months before that a coupon for a company called Air Rescue. And he gave it to our team leader, and within a matter of an hour, they had 4 planes, 2 from Houston, 2 from San Diego,
wow,
that flew in and had a team of 14 medical rescue personnel.
Wow.
And the next day, we were on the way back, 3 of us to San Diego and 2 to Houston.
Okay. You went to 2 different places,
right,
didn't you? Yes.
Right. And myself and Lynn Bryson and Vern went to San Diego Mercy Hospital, which at that time was the highest rated trauma hospital on the West Coast. So we were very fortunate to be able to go to a very, very good place for trauma surgeries, which was important to Lynn and I because we both had to have trauma surgery to our spine.
You both had trauma surgery. Dr. Pai, I remember his name.
Right.
And he was a great physician. It was a real blessing to have somebody that you could trust in that kind of a situation and know that he had done many surgeries like this. And he called it an implosion explosion kind of thing, didn't he?
Compression reaction.
Compression reaction.
Right.
And anyways, it was a bad break. And the question was whether you would be able to walk.
Right.
That was also in question, and the same for Lynn, right?
Right.
And so those were some things that we had to deal with there in the hospital. You were there in the hospital for what?
2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks, and you did get movement back in your legs, and you are walking today, so we know that.
I never ever believed that I wasn't going to be able to walk again. Nobody ever told me that I wasn't going to be able to walk. I remember about a week and a half after the surgery, they had told me you can go home when you can walk and when you can go to the bathroom again. And I'm thinking, no big deal. This is a no-brainer. I'm going to go home pretty quick then. It's no big deal. So they had me up walking with a walker within a week or so, or actually within a few days. They had to get you up and get your blood pressure equalized. I didn't realize when you lay down, your blood pressure equalizes, and you get used to laying down, and when you stand up, you get lightheaded. So they had to get you used to standing up slowly and that kind of thing. So that took a little bit of adjusting, but I didn't realize how fast your strength goes away because your muscles atrophy and go away. I lost 18 to 20 pounds in just a few days.
You were very thin.
Oh yeah,
I will say that.
I'm not a very big guy anyway, but I lost a lot of weight really quickly. But what I didn't realize is that the pain medications that they gave me, which was at that time morphine, which is a great medication for controlling pain, but it shuts your bowel and your bladders, it just stops, and I didn't know that. And so, you know, I'm having trouble going to the bathroom, and so my brother-in-law, your brother, told me, he says, Mike, if you want to go to the bathroom, you're going to have to get rid of that morphine. And I'm thinking, tough choice. Pain, go to the bathroom, pain, or that. But then I said, you know what, I want to go home, so get rid of that morphine. Well, then I went through withdrawal because I'd become addicted to the morphine just a short time, and there was some issues with that. But then that went away. But even after going off the morphine, I still had struggles. And then one afternoon, I remember going to the bathroom, and this little Filipino nurse walked in. I'll never forget it. Just going to the bathroom, and this nurse started crying.
She was so touched.
What is the problem? Did I get some on the floor, or what? She said, you don't know, do you? And I said, no, what? She said, we didn't think you were going to be able to do that again. And all of a sudden, I realized that they had not told me everything that
the severity
of what had happened to me. That they were actually concerned that the nerve damage to my back had been so severe that I was not going to be able to control certain functions. And so all of a sudden it hit me at how badly I had actually been injured. A friend named Steve Case gave me a book. The title of the book was You Gotta Keep Dancing, and it really didn't have anything to do with dancing. It really had to do with attitude towards pain and suffering. And it basically said this. He said, in this life, suffering and pain is inevitable. If you haven't hurt, you're going to hurt. You're going to have physical pain, you're going to have emotional pain, some kind of pain. But it said this. It says that pain is inevitable, but misery is optional. And I have to tell you, when I read that, it hit me so powerfully, because it said that I had a choice as to how I was going to deal with the pain that I was going to suffer. And the interesting thing is that the guy who wrote the book was a guy who had been on a camping trip where he had fallen 50 feet on a backpacking trip and landed flat on his back and just shattered his spine and his pelvis, and then he had literally hiked by himself down the mountain, because he was 3 days in on a backpacking climbing trip, and he drove 500 miles home, collapsed on the front porch of his house, and they thought he wasn't going to survive. But after surviving that trip that injury, he lived with chronic arthritic pain for the rest of his life. And he, after healing up, was dealing with it for every day for the rest of his life. And the doctors told him, after having some tests done, they said, "Look, Tim, here's the deal. I've got good news for you and I've got bad news. What you want first?" And he said, "Well, give me the bad news first." And he said, "Well, the bad news is there's nothing I can do for you." Well, how good can the good news then be? Well, the good news is there's nothing I can do for you. He says, "Well, I don't get it." He says, "Well, look, the pain you're dealing with is just, it's chronic pain. You can't hurt yourself by doing anything that you do. So you're going to hurt whether you do anything one way or the other. So what do you want to do? You want to sit at home and be miserable? Or do you want to get out and enjoy life? You know, take your pick."
So that kind of became your mantra also, wasn't it? I mean, when you read the book,
he basically came up with that line, pain is inevitable, but misery is optional. Choose your life, choose your life. And so that became my choice. I had people that were telling me, you know, you must know that God really loves you because he spared your life. You know, and I thought about that, you know, the lesson isn't that God loves me, it's just that I have something left to do. And whether I'm hurting or whether I'm not, it doesn't matter. You have something to do. So pain is inevitable, misery is optional. God loves you whether you're hurting or whether you're not.
Kind of brings back a lot of memories, a lot of things there. So, but I hope today that as you've listened to Mike's testimony, his story, that if you find yourself in a similar situation or you know somebody, just pray with them. Let them know that God has something more for them to do. Amen. Thank you for joining us today on Truth and Wellness, and I hope that you'll come back again. We have more stories, and we want to thank you.